Section 16 of Beacon Lights of History, Volume 4, Imperial Antiquity, by John Lord. This recording is in the public domain. Recording by K. Hand. St. Augustine, Part 2. The great work which preeminently called out his genius, and for which he would seem to have been raised up, was to combat the Pelagian heresy, and establish the doctrine of the necessity of divine grace. Even as it was the mission of Athanasius to defend the doctrine of the Trinity, and that of Luther to establish justification by faith. In all ages there are certain heresies, or errors, which have spread so dangerously, and been embraced so generally by the leading and fashionable classes, that they seem to require some extraordinary genius to arise in order to combat them successfully, and rescue the Church from the snares of a false philosophy. Thus Bernard was raised up to refute the rationalism and nominalism of Abélard, whose brilliant and subtle inquiries had a tendency to extinguish faith in the world, and bring all mysteries to the test of reason. The enthusiastic and inquiring young men who flocked to his lectures from all parts of Europe carried back to their homes and convents and schools insidious errors, all the more dangerous because they were mixed with truths which were universally recognized. It required such a man as Bernard to expose these sophistries and destroy their power, not so much by dialectical weapons as by appealing to those lofty truths, those profound convictions, those essential and immutable principles which consciousness reveals and divine authority confirms. It took a greater than Abélard to show the tendency of his speculations, from the logical sequence of which even he himself would have fled, and which he did reject when misfortunes had broken his heart, and disease had brought him to face the realities of the future life. So God raised up Pascal to expose the sophistries of the Jesuits, and unravel that subtle casuistry which was undermining the morality of the age, and destroying the authority of St. Augustine on some of the most vital principles which entered into the creed of the Catholic Church. Thus Jonathan Edwards, the ablest theologian which this country has seen, controverted the fashionable Arminianism of his day. Thus some great intellectual giant will certainly and in due time appear to demolish with scathing irony the theories and speculations of some of the progressive schools of our day, and present their absurdities and boastings and pretensions in such a ridiculous light that no man with any intellectual dignity will dare to belong to their fraternity, unless he impiously accepts, sometimes with ribald mockeries, the logical sequence of their doctrines. Now, it was not the Manicheans or Donatists who were the most dangerous people in the time of Augustine, nor were their doctrines likely to be embraced by the Christian schools, especially in the West, but it was the Pelagians, who in high places were assailing the Pauline theology. And they advocated principles which lay at the root of most of the subsequent controversies of the Church. They were intellectual men, generally good men, who could not be put down, and who would thrive under any opposition. Augustine did not attack the character of these men, but rendered a great service to the Church by pointing out, clearly and luminously, the anti-Christian character of their theories, when rigorously pushed out by a remorseless logic to their necessary sequence. Whatever value may be attached to that science which is based on deductions drawn from the truths of revelation, certain it is that it was theology which most interested Christians in the time of Augustine, as in the time of Athanasius, and his controversy with the Pelagians made then a mighty stir, and is at the root of half the theological discussions from that age to ours. If we would understand the changes of human thought in the Middle Ages, if we would seek to know what is most vital in Church history, that celebrated Pelagian controversy claims our special attention. It was at a great crisis in the Church when a British monk of extraordinary talents, persuasive eloquence, and great attainments, a man accustomed to the use of dialectical weapons and experienced by extensive travels, ambitious, ardent, plausible, adroit, appeared among the churches and advanced a new philosophy. His name was Pelagius, and he was accompanied by a man of still greater logical power than he himself possessed, though not so eloquent or accomplished or pleasing in manner, who was called Celestius, two doctors of whom the schools were justly proud, and who were admired and honored by enthusiastic young men, as Abélard was in after times. Nothing disagreeable marked these apostles of the new philosophy, nor could the malignant voice of theological hatred and envy bring upon their lives either scandal or reproach. They had none of the infirmities which so often have dimmed the lustre of great benefactors. They were not dogmatic like Luther, nor severe like Calvin, nor intolerant like Knox. Pelagius especially was a most interesting man, though more of a philosopher than a Christian. Like Zeno, he exalted the human will. Like Aristotle, he subjected all truth to the test of logical formularies. Like Abélard, he would believe nothing which he could not explain or comprehend. Self-confident, like Servetus, he disdained the cross. The central principle of his teachings was man's ability to practice any virtue, independently of divine grace. He made perfection a thing easy to be attained. There was no need in his eyes, as his adversaries maintained, of supernatural aid in the work of salvation. Hence a Saviour was needless. By faith he is represented to mean mere intellectual convictions, to be reached through the reason alone. Prayer was useful simply to stimulate a man's own will. He was further represented as repudiating miracles as contrary to reason, of abhorring divine sovereignty as fatal to the exercise of the will, of denying special providences as opposing the operation of natural laws, as rejecting native depravity and maintaining that the natural tendency of society was to rise in both virtue and knowledge, and of course rejecting the idea of a devil tempting man to sin. His doctrines, says one of his biographers, were pleasing to pride by flattering its pretension, to nature by exaggerating its power, and to reason by extolling its capacity. He asserted that death was not the penalty of Adam's transgression, he denied the consequences of his sin, and he denied the spiritual resurrection of man by the death of Christ, thus rejecting him as a divine Redeemer. Why should there be a divine redemption if man could save himself? He blotted out Christ from the book of life by representing him merely as a martyr suffering for the declaration of truths which were not appreciated, like Socrates at Athens or Savonarola at Florence. In support of all these doctrines, so different from those of Paul, he appealed not to the apostles' authority, but to human reason, and sought the aid of pagan philosophy rather than the Scriptures to arrive at truth. Thus was Pelagius represented by his opponents, who may have exaggerated his heresies, and have pushed his doctrines to a logical sequence which he would not accept but would even repel, in the same manner as the Pelagians drew deductions from the teachings of Augustine which were exceedingly unfair, making God the author of sin and election to salvation to depend on the foreseen conduct of men in regard to an obedience which they had no power to perform. But whether Pelagius did or did not hold all the doctrines of which he is accused, it is certain that the spirit of them was antagonistic to the teachings of Paul, as understood by Augustine, who felt that the very foundations of Christianity were assailed, as Athanasius regarded the doctrines of Arius. So he came to the rescue, not of the Catholic Church, for Pelagius belonged to it as well as he, but to the rescue of Christian theology. The doctrines of Pelagius were becoming fashionable and prevalent in many parts of the empire. Even the Pope at one time favored them. They might spread until they should be embraced by the whole Catholic world, for Augustine believed in the vitality of error as well as in the vitality of truth, of the natural and inevitable tendency of society towards paganism, without the especial and restraining grace of God. He armed himself for the great conflict with the infidelity of his day, not with David's sling but Goliath's sword. He used the same weapons as his antagonist, even the arms of reason and knowledge, and constructed an argument which was overwhelming, if Paul's epistles were to be accepted premises of his irresistible logic. Great as was Pelagius, Augustine was a far greater man, broader, deeper, more learned, more logical, more eloquent, more intense. He was raised up to demolish, with the very reason he professed to disdain, the sophistries and dogmas of one of the most dangerous enemies which the Church had ever known, to leave to posterity his logic and his conclusions when similar enemies of his faith should rise up in future ages. He furnished a thesaurus not merely to Bernard and Thomas Aquinas, but even to Calvin and Bossuet and Pascal. And it will be the marvellous lucidity of the Bishop of Hippo which shall bring back to the true faith, if it is ever brought back, that part of the Roman Catholic Church which accepts the verdict of the Council of Trent, when that famous council endorsed the opinions of Pelagius, while upholding the authority of Augustine as the greatest doctor of the Church. To a man like Augustine, with his deep experiences, a man rescued from a seductive philosophy and a corrupt life, as he thought, by the special grace of God and in answer to his mother's prayers, the views of Pelagius were both false and dangerous. He could find no words sufficiently intense whereby to express his gratitude for his deliverance from both sin and error. To him this deliverer is so personal, so loving, that he pours out his confession to him as if he were both friend and father. And he felt that all that is vital in theology must radiate from the recognition of his sovereign power in the renovation and salvation of the world. All his experiences and observations of life confirmed the authority of Scripture, that the world, as a matter of fact, was sunk in a state of sin and misery, and could be rescued only by that divine power which converted Paul. His views of predestination, grace, and providence all radiate from the central principle of the majesty of God and the littleness of man. All his ideas of the servitude of the will are confirmed by his personal experience of the awful fetters which sin imposes, and the impossibility of breaking away from them without direct aid from the God who ruleth the world in love. And he had an infinitely greater and deeper conviction of the reality of this divine love which had rescued him than Pelagius had, who felt that his salvation was the result of his own merits. The views of Augustine were infinitely more cheerful than those of his adversary respecting salvation, since they gave more hope to the miserable population of the empire who could not claim the virtues of Pelagius, and were impotent of themselves to break away from the bondage which degraded them. There is nothing in the writings of Augustine, not in this controversy or any other controversy, to show that God delights in the miseries or the penalty which are indissolubly connected with sin. On the contrary, he blesses and adores the divine hand which releases men from the constraints which sin imposes. This divine interposition is wholly based on a divine and infinite love. It is the helping hand of omnipotence to the weak will of man, the weak will even of Paul, when he exclaimed, "The evil that I would not, that I do." It is the unloosing, by his loving assistance, of the wings by which the emancipated soul would rise to the lofty regions of peace and contemplation. I know very well that the doctrines which Augustine systematized from Paul involved questions which we cannot answer. For why should not an infinite and omnipotent God give to all men the saving grace that he gave to Augustine? Why should not this loving and compassionate Father break all the fetters of sin everywhere, and restore the primeval paradise in this wicked world where Satan seems to reign? Is he not more powerful than devils? Alas! the prevalence of evil is more mysterious than the origin of evil. But this is something, and it is well for the critic and opponent of the Augustinian theology to bear this in mind, that Augustine was an earnest seeker after truth, even when enslaved by the fornications of Carthage, and his own free will in persistently seeking truth, through all the mazes of Manichean and Grecian speculation, is as manifest as the divine grace which came to his assistance. God Almighty does not break fetters until there is some desire in men to have them broken. If men will hug sins, they must not complain of their bondage. Augustine recognized free will, which so many think he ignored, when his soul aspired to a higher life. When a drunkard in his agonies cries out to God, then help is near. A drowning man who calls for a rope when a rope is near stands a good chance of being rescued. I need not detail the results of this famous controversy. Augustine, appealing to the consciousness of mankind as well as to the testimony of Paul, prevailed over Pelagius, who appealed to the pride of reason. In those dreadful times there were more men who felt the need of divine grace than there were philosophers who revelled in the speculations of the Greeks. The danger from the Pelagians was not far from their organization as a sect, but their opinions as individual men. Probably there were all shades of opinion among them, from a modest and thoughtful semi-Pelagianism to the rankest infidelity. There have always been, and probably ever will be, skeptical and rationalistic people, even in the bosom of the Church. Now, had it not been for Augustine, a profound thinker, a man of boundless influence and authority, it is not unlikely that Pelagianism would have taken so deep a root in the mind of Christendom, especially in the hearts of princes and nobles, that it would have become the creed of the Church. Even as it was never fully eradicated in the schools and in the courts among worldly people of culture and fashion. But the fame of Augustine does not rest on his controversies with heretics and schismatics alone. He wrote treatises on almost all subjects of vital interest to the Church. His essay on the Trinity is worthy of Athanasius, and has never been surpassed in lucidity and power. His soliloquies on a blissful life, and the order of the universe, and the immortality of the soul, are pregnant with the richest thought, equal to the best treatises of Cicero or Boethius. His commentary on the Psalms is sparkling with tender effusions, in which every thought is a sentiment, and every sentiment is a blazing flame of piety and love. Perhaps his greatest work was the amusement of his leisure hours for 13 years, a philosophical treatise called The City of God, in which he raises and replies to all the great questions of his day, a sort of Christian poem upon our origin and end, and a final answer to pagan theogonies, a final sentence on all the gods of antiquity. In that marvellous book he soars above his ordinary excellence, and develops the designs of God in the history of states and empires, furnishing for Bossuet the groundwork of his universal history. Its great excellence, however, is its triumphant defence of Christianity over all other religions, the last of the great apologies which, while settling the faith of the Christian world, demolished forever the last stronghold of a defeated paganism. As ancient Egypt pronounced judgments on her departed kings before proceeding to their burial, so Augustine interrogates the gods of antiquity, shows their impotence to sustain the people who worshipped them, triumphantly sings their departed greatness, and seals with his powerful hand the sepulchre into which they were consigned forever. Besides all the treatises of Augustine, exegetical, apologetical, dogmatical, polemical, ascetic, and autobiographical, 363 of his sermons have come down to us, and numerous letters to the great men and women of his time. Perhaps he wrote too much and too loosely, without sufficient regard to art, like Varro, the most voluminous writer of antiquity, and to whose writings Augustine was much indebted. If Saint Augustine had written less and with more care, his writings would now be more read and more valued. Thucydides compressed the labors of his literary life into a single volume, but that volume is immortal, is a classic, is a textbook. Yet no work of man is probably more lasting than the Confessions of Augustine, from the extraordinary affluence and subtlety of his thoughts and his burning, fervid, passionate style. When books were scarce and dear, his various works were the food of the Middle Ages, and what better books ever nourished the European mind in a long period of ignorance and ignominy? So that we cannot overrate his influence in giving a direction to Christian thought. He lived in the writings of the sainted doctors of the scholastic schools, and he was a very favored man in living to a good old age, wearing the harness of a Christian laborer and the armor of a Christian warrior until he was 76. He was a bishop nearly 40 years. For 40 years he was the oracle of the Church, the light of doctors. His social and private life had also great charms. He lived the doctrines that he preached. He completely triumphed over the temptations which once assailed him. Everybody loved as well as revered him, so genial was his humanity, so broad his charity. He was affable, courteous, accessible, full of sympathy and kindness. He was tolerant of human infirmities in an age of angry controversy and ascetic rigors. He lived simply, but was exceedingly hospitable. He cared nothing for money, and gave away what he had. He knew the luxury of charity, having no superfluities. He was forgiving as well as tolerant, saying, "It is necessary to pardon offences not 7 times, but 70 times 7." No one could remember an idle word from his lips after his conversion. His humility was as marked as his charity, ascribing all his triumphs to divine assistance. He was not a monk, but gave rules to monastic orders. He might have been a metropolitan patriarch or pope, but he was contented with being bishop of a little Numidian town. His only visits beyond the sanctuary were to the poor and miserable. As he won every heart by love, so he subdued every mind by eloquence. He died leaving no testament, because he had no property to bequeath but his immortal writings, some 130 distinct productions. He died in the year 430, when his city was besieged by the Vandals, and in the arms of his faithful Alypius, then a neighboring bishop, full of visions of the ineffable beauty of that blissful state to which his renovated spirit had been for 40 years constantly soaring. Thus ceased to flow, said a contemporary, that river of eloquence which had watered the thirsty fields of the Church. Thus passed away the glory of preachers, the master of doctors, and the light of scholars. Thus fell the courageous combatant who with the sword of truth had given heresy a mortal blow. Thus set this glorious sun of Christian doctrine, leaving a world in darkness and in tears. His vacant see had no successor. The African province, the cherished jewel of the Roman Empire, sparkled for a while in the Vandal diadem. The Greek supplanted the Vandal, and the Saracen supplanted the Greek, and the home of Augustine was blotted out from the map of Christendom. The light of the gospel was totally extinguished in northern Africa. The acts of Rome and the doctrines of Cyprian were equally forgotten by the Mohammedan conquerors. Only in Bona, as Hippo is now called, has the memory of the great bishop been cherished, the one solitary flower which escaped the successive desolations of Vandals and Saracens. And when Algiers was conquered by the French in 1830, the sacred relics of the saint were transferred from Pavia, where they had been deposited by the order of Charlemagne, in a coffin of lead, enclosed in a coffin of silver, and the whole secured in a sarcophagus of marble, and finally committed to the earth near the scenes which had witnessed his transcendent labors. I do not know whether any monument of marble and granite was erected to his memory, but he needs no chiseled stone, no storied urn, no marble bust, to perpetuate his fame. For nearly 1,500 years he has reigned as the great oracle of the Church, Catholic and Protestant, in matters of doctrine. The precursor of Bernard, of Leibnitz, of Calvin, of Bossuet, all of whom reproduced his ideas and acknowledged him as the fountain of their own greatness. Whether, said one of the late martyred archbishops of Paris, he reveals to us the foundations of an impure polytheism, so varied in its developments, yet so uniform in its elemental principles, or whether he sports with the most difficult problems of philosophy, and throws out thoughts which in after times are sufficient to give an immortality to Descartes, we always find in this great doctor all that human genius, enlightened by the Spirit of God, can explain, and also to what a sublime height reason herself may soar when allied with faith. Authorities. The voluminous works of St. Augustine, especially his Confessions. Mabillon, Tillemont, and Baronius have written very fully of this great father. See also Vaughan's Life of Thomas Aquinas. Neander, Geisler, Mosheim, and Milman endorse, in the main, the eulogium of Catholic writers. There are numerous popular biographies, of which those of Bailly and Schaff are among the best. But the most satisfactory book I have read is the History of M. Pougelet, in 3 volumes, issued at Paris in 1846. Butler, in his Lives of the Saints, has an extended biography. Even Gibbon pays a high tribute to his genius and character. End of section 16.